All right. Well, Ash, I read this book months ago when it was just a manuscript, and Wendy Sheenan had sent out one of the few copies. And I just got so excited about it because it's such a gorgeous book, and it just tells the story so well. And it was pretty exciting to see that you were the lead book in the New York Times book review as well. So I I at the end of the book, you list a lot of thank yous to people, acknowledgments. And it made me curious about the process by which you created this, because it seemed like you had a lot of people helping you. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes, and I actually, now that it's been about 2 years since I wrote those acknowledgments, and I keep kicking myself of the people that I left out, along the
Yeah.
way. And I'm actually in an Airbnb in Seattle right now. I've been on sort of a stock signing tour, visiting independent bookstores up the West Coast. And so on my way up, I was able to stop in Klamath and actually hand a physical book to some of the loggers and mill workers who helped me during the research process, who I think
Mhm.
probably thought I was a raving lunatic because I showed up in 2014 saying, hey, I'm writing a book, and then there's been no book for the next 7 years. So that was a good feeling to hand it to them.
Yeah.
And I stopped and visited with Carol Van Strom in Five Rivers, Oregon, which is a community that was deeply impacted by 2,4,5-T spraying, and a community along with Alcy down the road that was really pivotal in actually getting that herbicide taken off the market in the US. So it was really rewarding to hand it to her too. But to loop back to your original question, this was a very long process. I think partially because I'd never written a novel before. And so part of writing your first novel, come to find out, is teaching yourself how to write a novel, which I'm sure there's a simpler way to do it. I just did it wrong the first time and the second time and the third time and many subsequent times until sort of through a series of stumbles and dumb luck, ended up with a team of people that really helped me give it its final form and bring it into the world. So I always knew I wanted to write a book about herbicide spraying in this part of California, at the mouth of the Klamath River, because my own family had lived in that area when I was a young child. And we'd relied on a creek for drinking water, similar to Rich and Colleen set up in the book. And the timberlands around where we lived were then owned by a company called Simpson Timber. And they were actively logging in the area, and they were actively spraying. And my parents became very concerned about herbicides getting into our drinking water, and actually started drinking only bottled water, which at that time period in that extremely rural, isolated place made them extremely eccentric. And that habit has stuck, 35 years later. No one in my family drinks from the tap, even though we live very far from Klamath, California. And so I always knew I wanted to write a book about that. And I started it when I was at the Iowa Writers, shortly before I got to the Iowa Writers Workshop. Actually, I started it in July of 2010. And a month later, I quit my job in the Washington, D.C. area and went to live in the Midwest, where I'd never lived before. And Iowa City was just a fantastic town. Like, who knew that there would be this UNESCO World City of Literature in the middle of the cornfields of Iowa? But there is. And so I worked on this book by myself, pretty much in secret, with a few friends I confided in, because I'm extremely thin-skinned. And everything that I took into workshop at Iowa, I worked really hard on, and I felt very good about and protective of, and I brought to the workshop table. And then a bunch of writers who are much better writers than I am, very astutely pointed out all the ways in which that story wasn't working, and every story died. And so I thought, oh, you better not take that novel out until you're sure it can breathe on its own. And so I had this little note on the inside of my apartment door that said, don't talk to anyone about your novel until you finish it. And so it was right at eye level, and I looked at it every time I walked out of the apartment into town, so I wouldn't tip my hand to anyone. And I worked on it pretty much like that for almost 7 years. I had a few writer friends who kindly looked at it when I was sort of getting to the point where I felt like I don't think I can take this any farther on my own. And I sent a note to an agent that I'd met at Iowa years earlier. I'd kept his original email so he wouldn't think I was crazy, to show that we had actually corresponded if he didn't remember me. And I sent it to him, and I didn't hear from him. I sent it to him in November, and 1 month went by, 2 months went by, 5 months went by, and a normal person would say, okay, clearly that agent doesn't want it, and move on to the next. But for some reason, I just waited. And his first child had been born, and he'd had a lot going on, and he offered to represent me and worked on the book for 2 years about with me, and then sent it out to editors in July of 2019 on a Thursday afternoon. It went out to the editors, and by Monday morning, there were multiple interested parties. So it was a long road to get there, but then I was very fortunate that there were people waiting for me at the end. And those acknowledgements, I feel like, detail some of the sort of twists and turns along the way. But I think that reflecting back now, there were so many people who offered just a small bit of encouragement, or listened when I was really feeling like this would maybe never become something. And I don't know if they realized at the moment, like, how much I just needed that one sort of moment of kindness from that. And I think about that in my writing life, but in my daily life too, that like who you are standing with on the street corner, you don't know where they are on their path. And so it's a good reminder to me to try to be kind.
Yeah. Sounds like quite a path. While you were in the midst of writing all of this, were you also working a job and doing other things, or did you have the time to just concentrate on the writing?
Yes, I worked the entire time I was working on it. I started out, when I first started it, I was working as a case manager in a resettlement office of the International Rescue Committee, with political asylees and victims of human trafficking and some refugee families. Mm-hmm. And then in Iowa, I taught, which was certainly not the same schedule, but I'd never taught before. And I come from a family of school teachers, but teaching college kids was totally different. And yeah, I'm very, very shy and introverted by personality, so I was terrified. And the irony of it was that it was a class that was sort of a mix of rhetoric and public speaking. So here you have someone who's terrified to speak publicly, in charge of teaching these 20, 18-year-olds how to speak publicly. So it was a good learning experience for me. I hope it was a good experience for them. It has been really fun over the years, actually. Many of those students have kept in touch. You know, they need letters of recommendation and things like that. So the kids I taught my first year at Iowa, some of them have now graduated from medical school, which makes me really feel my age. But that was a great experience. And then I had a job at the International Writing Program in Iowa City, which brings writers from all over the world: Afghanistan, Iran, Yemen, Germany, South Korea, to Iowa City for, I can't remember whether it's 9 or 11 weeks, in sort of a writing residency program. And so it's this wonderful international exchange that exposed me to a lot of international writers whose work I might not have come across without it. And then I thought I was close to finishing my book. And so I decided, well, I'm going to save up and then quit my job and move home and finish my book and then go get another job. So I gave my work a lot of notice. I quit my job. I moved home to Flagstaff, Arizona, where my family is, thinking, oh, I need maybe 6 months, I'll finish this book, and then I'll move somewhere else. And I lasted about 3 weeks before I realized, like, oh, you need a job. You can't handle writing full time, because, you know, I'll write 3 or 4 hours a day, and then that's sort of the amount of creativity I have. And then I just spend any other available time beyond those 3 to 4 hours, I spend worrying. So it's better for me to have something useful to do with myself. And so I got my current job. I'm the communications manager for a conservation nonprofit called the Grand Canyon Trust. And that job was actually, even though we work on some forestry issues related to mainly to logging in a more sustainable way to avoid catastrophic wildfire. So it's a very different type of forestry than depicted in the book, but it was very useful in many ways, because the job sent me into public meetings on environmental issues like uranium mining and milling, and issues related to coal plants shutting down, and issues that made me realize that the community I was writing about in Klamath, California in the late 70s, the concerns are not that different from people working in other extractive industry. And it also made me realize that, like, people are complicated and interesting, and there's not a clear dichotomy between the environmental movement on one side and people working in extractive industry on the other, because everyone, regardless of whether you stand on issues of environmental regulation, you love your kids and you want them to have clean air and clean water, and you don't want to do anything knowingly that would harm the people you love. And even when we disagree, like, people are generally operating from a place of wanting to provide for their families and build a good life for the people that they love. And so my current job has been really helpful, I think. And it was helpful in writing this book, and I think it's just helpful to me as a human being to remember that, like, it's important to sit down at the table and have the difficult conversation with someone who is on the opposite side of an issue from you.
Yeah, and I think that comes out in the book too, because, you know, the struggle to convince people that the 2,4,5-T is actually doing some damage, and logging 95% of the forests in 100 years with forests running out. It's just these inevitable consequences of how we sometimes have dealt with nature, and are in denial about invisible things that don't necessarily have an immediate impact, but when they do, it's significant, like COVID. So as you created these characters, are there any that you drew from personal experience? Because, you know, the dialogue that you have in the book has quite a bit of diversity in it. And I just wondered, you know, is this from people that you've met, or did you just imagine this?
I think that's the kindest way someone has asked, why does your book have so much profanity in it?
No, I've been working class my whole life. And I just thought, you know, you just took us there and kept us there all the way to the end.
Oh,
So
thank you.
I was just really impressed, because there was an honesty to it, but there was also an empathy that I really appreciated.
That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. So the characters are invented. I did a number of interviews in Klamath, California, that I transcribed. None of the dialogue comes directly from them. There are a few turns of phrase that are borrowed or adapted from things people said, but most things are invented, as the characters are. I think the only character who bears any passing resemblance to someone I actually know is Lark. And he's sort of an amalgam of both of my grandfathers and a great uncle who they had one way of speaking when women were present and another way of speaking when they were not. And I think that's one of the advantages of being a child, and you're just lower to the ground and people don't notice, especially if you're a quiet child. You're often sort of slip in rooms where people don't necessarily notice that you're observing. And so I think, and as a child, I think I was always sort of interested in the conversations that weren't accessible to me. And so I think I should be very clear that neither of my grandfathers nor my uncle were loggers, but they were working class men who spoke in some ways in ways that are similar to Lark. And so I think if we'd grown up together, there are things in there that you would recognize, oh, that's Grandpa Roy. But we would have had to share that childhood. So I think like my sister can recognize those moments. And what has been interesting is there were so many things that I found in the course of research that were things that I wrote into my book, and then later when I was interviewing, someone actually said. And that was kind of wild and very rewarding to hear someone unprompted say verbatim something that you'd written on the page. And then there have been some strange ways in which like the true stories rhyme with something that came from my imagination. For example, Lark in the book has that pet squirrel. And I was one of the loggers who I interviewed for the book. I stopped by his house to give him a copy the week before, and I hadn't seen him in years. And so we just sat on the porch and talked for a few hours. And when we were maybe 2 hours in, he told me about this pet raccoon he'd had. And it's not the same animal, not the same circumstance, but there were certain things like that. That raccoon apparently they make fairly good pets when they're little, but then they create quite a problem with their claws as they get older. And this story ended rather sadly for the German Shepherd next door started some sort of fight with the raccoon and ended up short a nose at the end of the story. So there were some things like that sitting with him that I was like, oh, you didn't tell me that the first time, but it reminds me of something from the book, even though I didn't know that at the time. That I wrote it. So that's a very long way of saying they're invented. The characters are invented.
Okay. Well, Nan, I can see you on screen. Do you have a vocal?
Is that better?
Yes, you don't sound like Minnie Mouse at all any longer.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, since I've been doing this a few minutes, why don't you go ahead and ask questions and take care of the chat so that other people can ask questions as well. Okay. Is that okay?
I'm just so glad to hear that Lark was sort of based on real people, because I love Lark so much. Yeah. He's my favorite. Okay, so folks, I think that there are a reasonable amount of us. So if anybody has questions, I think you could just unmute yourself. Maybe just raise your hand. Go ahead, Nancy McDaniel.
Ash and I have had a little bit of email communication. Hi, Ash. And one of the things that I loved, well, I just loved everything about this book, but one of the things I loved so much was that I didn't see it as, now I'm going to shove down your throat how terrible it is to do logging of old growth, which, by the way, I think it is. But also, and I thought it was so brilliant, the way you sort of wove the herbicide stuff in there. And it took me for a while, maybe I'm just like dumb, but it took me for a while to realize, oh, damn, this is a pattern. I mean, yeah, oh, miscarriage and this and that and stuff. And it wasn't just like real in your face, which I appreciated a great deal. I mean, I would agree with all of that, but I just thought that was, and I actually sent an email to a friend who was in fighter pilot in Vietnam who was impacted by Agent Orange. And I sent this to him and I said, this sounds kind of like Agent Orange, doesn't it? Before we realized that it was. Anyway, so I loved that. And I loved, you know, all this sort of, when I described this book to friends, and I said, you know, I would say it's about logging and it's about old growth. And then they were, I said, but it's also these magnificent relationships. So I guess my question is, I'm sorry, I'm just babbling, but my question is sort of, how did you, particularly in your first book, how did you kind of merge the talking about important issues with the developing of the characters? Sorry, that's dumb.
But no, that's such a good question. And that's a question that I struggle with for a long time, because I'm drawn to, if you're going to spend 10 years writing about something, you better be interested in it, right? Because it has to sustain your attention for all of that time. And I think the same is true with characters. If you're going to spend 10 years with people, you better care about them, because you're going to spend a lot of time together. Like 3 hours a day for 10 years is a lot of time with people, even when those people are figments of your imagination. And so that question, I don't think I really understood was a problem for me until several years in, because I'm interested in the mechanics of logging, in the engineering of logging, in the machinery. I'm interested in the vocabulary of that field, and I was interested in the herbicides, how they worked, what their history was in real life. And a lot of those details, if that's really what you want to write about, then you should write a nonfiction book, you know, and people have done that. There's a story to be told there. And so I think I realized, I went in with this sort of naive idea that I could write about this issue and that I would just sort of use characters to explore it, really because I wanted a book that talked about 2,4,5-T use in the Klamath, California area. And if someone had written that book already, a nonfiction book, I probably wouldn't have written this novel, because I was looking for that book and no one had written it yet. And I'm a fiction writer. And so this is what I know how to do. And so I set out to write a book about herbicides. But then when I actually started sinking into what life is actually like in Klamath based on my parents' stories, and just the reality of almost everyone who lives there is either working in some field related to the timber industry, or they have friends or neighbors who were at that time. There are some people who are working in the fishing industry in that area, but most people were related to timber in some way. And so I realized that if I wanted to write about herbicides and with people living in that area, then I needed to write about loggers, because that's who was living there in that time. And my parents, I don't have a personal connection to the logging industry. My parents had friends and neighbors who were connected to that industry. And so it was very foreign to me at the beginning. And so I had to learn sort of the way a reader does, I think. And I think that I could understand that there may still be too much logging in the book for people who aren't interested in logging, but this is nothing compared to what I started with, and it just kept being pruned back and pruned back. And I think just the nature of storytelling, although there are books that I think go against this, you know, like a book like The Overstory, where really the environment and the forest itself is where the attention is, and characters sort of come and go as part of that larger story. But I think the type of fiction I was most familiar with had characters in the foreground and the issues in the background. And I think that is something that I'll probably struggle with my whole writing life of, this is really interesting and I've researched it and I have all these facts about it that I want to share with you. But when it comes down to it, people are smart, readers are smart. They don't need a lot of, like, you don't need a lot of information or a lot of breadcrumbs to be able to piece things together. And part of the pleasure of reading, I think, is to sort of pick up the clues as you go along and put them in your backpack, and then at the end sort of figure out what you can make from everything you've collected. So I think that, like, the short answer to your question, Nancy, I think is like by a lot of trial and error, and probably starting way too issue focused, and realizing that I had to understand why a person, in order to write the book that I wanted to write, I had to understand how someone would think about it completely, in a completely different way. From the point of view of people who would have said, it's no problem, I don't know what you're worried about. And from the point of view of people who are maybe applying the herbicides. And so it was a lot of trial and error is the short answer.
Just my last comment, and then I'm muting, is my favorite book from 2020 was The Overstory. And my favorite book from 2021 is your book.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind of you to say.
Okay, does anybody have another question? Allison.
It isn't really a question, Ash, but I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. Your endings of chapters are so masterful. It took me a while to twig to it as I was reading along, but you're such a mistress of a very tight, compressed ending of a chapter that resonates in a very poetic way. I think I started underlining at the end of chapters because I was finding, wow, she's conveyed all this information in one sentence, really effectively. And you would build tension for what was happening, and it would also reverberate back through what had preceded the chapter. So, I mean, I don't know how hard you had to work on those chapter endings, if that was part of the pruning back process, but I just thought some of them were really exquisitely done. And the other thing I wanted to comment on, a couple of people have touched on the empathy in the book. I was really impressed by that. I lived in Western Oregon for a while, actually not that far from LC. I lived the mailing address was Philomath, so I was fairly close west of Corvallis. And I came from California, and I was sort of like, logging, awful. But I was in a teaching situation where I had an opportunity to work with a logger, one guy in particular who had been injured in a logging accident and was retraining. And it was such a window into, that it was his family's life was logging, his father, his grandfather. And so I was very impressed and really moved by, all the different varieties of people who you managed to capture in the book, the guy doing the investigation into the herbicide, Daniel, and the hardcore loggers and the language of logging. You caught that really, really well, I thought. So yeah, not really questions, I guess, but maybe about the chapter endings. I'd be curious to know about that.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. That's very kind. I just passed through, is it Philomath?
Philomath.
My pronunciations are, I just learned that near Port Angeles it's Squim, which I've been mispronouncing my entire life. But I just bought a poetry book by a young woman named Sally Keith.
Yes. It's called
yeah. So it's funny how, how when you learn a new word, suddenly you see it everywhere. But that's very meaningful coming from someone who's lived in an area where it sounds like a lot of the issues and the reality was similar to
very similar. Yeah.
Klamath. I can't tell you how happy I am that you noticed those chapter endings, because I worked really hard on them, often for many, many years, because I'm the type of writer where usually I start with the ending and then I go back to the beginning and write to that ending. And so sometimes it wouldn't work, like I had, this is the note that the chapter needs to end on. And then I would go back to the beginning, and I don't know why that is just how my brain works, but sometimes, often when I would do that, I would go back and start, and then I would write the whole scene and then realize that, oh, that doesn't end where I need it to end. So I'd have to go back and try again from a different point and see if that would end at the right place. So it's a very inefficient way to write a novel. But I think because I didn't know what I was doing, probably in large part, but also because so much of figuring out how to structure it in terms of the plot was thinking not only about what was happening in terms of events and like keeping the dates straight and all of those types of things, but it was like sort of tracking the emotional sort of arc of the book and knowing that this chapter needs to end on a reflective note. This chapter needs to end on a point of sadness. This chapter needs to end on a point of joy. And I think I really enjoy endings in books generally, and at the end of chapters where like something, it's like it tightens just a little bit, so you have this moment where it slows down enough for you to feel something. And so before you turn the page, you have a feeling. And I don't know that I did it successfully every time, but I did really try to get, because people are busy, the chapters are fairly short, and I notice myself as a reader, working full time and often reading for, sometimes only a few minutes before I go to bed. A short chapter is something where I can read a chapter and still feel like I got some reading time, which is a huge source of joy. And so I wanted, from a reader perspective, if you were only going to read one chapter in the book, maybe it's only 3 pages, but that there's something to feel at the end. And so thank you so much for noticing all of that labor.
Yeah, they were really great. I mean, so many of them, there's just like a little kind of a click, I guess I noticed endings. I mean, I'm trained as a poet, so I tend to notice endings, is it a hard ending or a soft ending, and what's the feeling that it's got. So yeah, they were very nice. Yeah.
Yes, I think if I could choose a different art form for myself, it would be poetry. I love to read it, but I'm no good at writing it.
All right, does anybody else have a question? I'll make a comment that I said to Ash earlier when we were messaging back and forth. I just got into the part where Chubb got hurt, and our coworker Natalie called me about something else, and I was about in tears, and I said, if she kills the dog and Chubb, I am done. So she's like, you're fine. Somebody's going to die, but you're fine. So Kate Montgomery, did you raise your hand? Did I see? And Ash, Kate's calling us from Japan.
Yeah, hi. So the book is set in the 70s, but I was wondering, like back in the 70s and people didn't have such a clear idea of what herbicides did yet. So I was wondering, since you've been in touch with the logging communities now, do you have a sense of how attitudes have changed towards herbicides and the environmental movement in general?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer it. But I'll tell you, for the very sort of slim sample that I have, just anecdotally. So one thing that really surprised me going in was I had assumed that people working in the logging industry wouldn't be concerned about herbicides and their potential health impacts, which I think is probably a shortcoming of imagination on my part. But I went in very reluctant to speak to loggers about herbicide use because I thought I knew how they would respond. And I found in the course of interviewing people that assumption on my part was really naive, because I was told, I think there are differing opinions about, I don't know, almost sort of the morality of logging, because I think there is certainly a camp of people who believes that wood that forests are timber and timber is a product and it grows back and it's a sustainable crop. The way, you know, you plant wood the way you plant corn. I had multiple people say that, some variation of that to me. And so, but some of the loggers I spoke with shared stories about being sprayed when they were working. You know, there was often not great communication between the office that was coordinating the spray helicopters and the guys who were actually out on the sides working in the woods. And they had some pretty horrific stories of being, you know, being sprayed over. And then one man described it as, it was like his tongue was so numb, it was like it had been shot full of Novocaine. And like once someone told me a story about getting so doused, they had to go back to the office and shower because they were that soaked. And so people shared stories about, you know, how it affected them, how their breathing, their eyes, their skin. And so they certainly, I think knew that it was bad stuff and you didn't want to be exposed to it, but it also sort of seemed to be like, this is necessary in order for us to work. And it seems that, I mean, I take some liberties in the book in terms of describing the spraying. Like in most cases, spraying was used when they had replanted, when they'd logged old growth forest and they'd replanted crop trees. And then those crop trees were in competition with other types of trees that could shade them out and prevent them from growing as quickly. So they would spray them to kill the broadleaf plants like alder that grow more quickly and let the crop trees that were going to actually pay for themselves grow up faster. And so I think it was sort of an acceptance of like, this is part, like in order for us to have a job and support our families, this is sort of a necessary evil that we go with. I don't know how much people really thought about the long-term effects and the things that you, as Todd was alluding to, the things you can't see. And I think, you know, America, settler America, doesn't have a great ability to sort of project itself down several generations and imagine what the impacts of our actions today will be down the road. And I think this is one example of that. And I think if you look in communities like Five Rivers and Alsea in Oregon, it was really people who were living in forest communities and being sprayed. You know, their water sources were being sprayed, their gardens were being sprayed. Carol Van Strom got interested in writing a Bitterfug because her 4 children were playing by the creek and got with their dog, the family dog, and got sprayed and got really sick. The dog later died and wanted to know what was in that tanker truck. And so it has been very interesting to see. I think that the honest answer to your question is that in any community, and logging is no different, you'll find people sort of all over the spectrum in terms of thinking, in terms of their thinking about chemical sprays. And I think that there are certainly a segment of people who think that it's necessary and can be done safely. And there's a segment of people who think that you can't, when you spray something from a helicopter, you can't control where it ends up, especially in areas like Klamath and parts of Oregon where people really rely on surface water for drinking water. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things about researching this book, even though was very focused on this period of the late 70s, one of the saddest things about it was realizing that this is still an issue today for people who live in forest communities, especially in Oregon, where the regime is less protective than in Washington or California. And there are still families whose water sources are being sprayed, not by 2,4,5-T, because that has been banned for forestry use and hasn't been used at all in the US since the mid 80s. It was banned for forestry use in 1979. But they're, you know, you take one off the market and 5 step into the aisle. And I think like all one has to do is go to the yard care aisle at your local Walmart and turn over the bottles and see how many products 2,4-D is still in, even knowing how much potential harm could be done to people. So I think that that's a very long way of saying, from my limited experience and the small number of people that I spoke to, I think there are people who certainly recognize that it's dangerous, and people who think that it can be done safely. And then there's sort of every shade of gray in between. But it's a good question.
Well, and in logging, which in your description seems to be an extremely dangerous profession, you're balancing that chemical use with all of the other things that you're facing on a daily basis. So one of the points that you had made in an earlier interview is that don't blame the workers. You know, they're just doing their job and trying to get by. But, you know, but look for the truth.
I think that's certainly true. And I think that we have a tendency as a society to blame workers, that they somehow bring any suffering they incur on themselves. Like you were somehow asking for cancer, or you were asking for contamination in your water. And I don't think that's fair at all. Like whatever you think of logging and the destruction and deforestation of America's forests, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a person who hasn't at one time inhabited a building made of wood or read a book printed on paper. And so like the demands of the market and the demands of the planet are not always compatible. And I think that it's unfair to blame the people who are putting their lives on the line so that you can walk into Home Depot and buy a nice redwood board to build a deck, for the environmental consequences of their industry, especially when people who work in those professions are often on the front lines in terms of exposure to environmental contaminants, and are the first to pay the price along with their families for the environmental impacts of an industry that doesn't always view them as a valuable resource, but more you know, sort of cogs in the machine that can be, if they get sick, they can be replaced.
Yeah.
Ash, Nancy McDaniel would like to know what you're working on now and when we'll see that.
Sure. And then I see Larry Nelson has his hand up. I am, I told you I'm slow, Nancy. So I think it'll probably be another 10 years, probably 8 years from now is what I'm shooting for. I'm working on a novel that's about the world of wildland fire. So I work a desk job, but I live in the American West, where wildfire is, I think it's probably fair to say it's a season now, and it's a longer and longer season. And it's an issue that I think is really interesting and related to forests and our management of them. And it's also a way for me, I work in front of a computer screen most of the day. And so I get up pretty early to write in the morning, usually. And so I have my 3 hours to spend anywhere I choose on the page. So I'll spend them in the forest. They'll be different forests than the redwoods of this novel, but also in the woods.
Larry, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, I have a comment and a couple real quick questions. First of all, I don't remember the last time I read a 442-page book in 4 days. So that is a compliment to you as a writer. I didn't think I'd get it done, but I did. I enjoyed it. I did hear Nancy say how much she liked Lark. I think a side project should be a prequel of Lark's life. That would be a book that I would like to read. But I have 3 questions that you may not want to answer, but they were questions that I had when I finished the book yesterday. So if you don't want to answer them, it's fine. But when I closed the book yesterday, I said, how did Lark make his money? And I said, I understand why someone like Merle would get away scot-free, but I really wanted something bad to happen to Eugene. And I wondered why nothing bad happened to Eugene. And my final question is, what are the chances that Colleen's new baby will be born healthy? Those were the questions that I was sitting with last night.
Oh, only the easy questions, huh? Oh, those are all 3 tough. I'm very impressed that you could read it in 4 days, because even me reading it aloud to myself without stopping takes more than 2 days. So thank you very much for your reading time. Lark's money, I spent a long time trying to figure that out in my mind. And so I'll spare you all the accounting and these types of things. But what it comes down to is there are a couple of things in my balance sheets for him. One is several decades of running that tour through tree on his property and living he's off the grid, basically. He has no expenses. He's on a parcel of allotted. He has purchased a parcel that was an allotment, and so he doesn't have any sort of daily expenses. He doesn't drive. He is able to trade for almost everything that he needs, and so his costs are 0. He has all the firewood revenue and the tour through tree revenue, and he has a couple of large dice wins from the Only that he has squirreled away over time. And he had this is way more detail than you want, but CD rates were quite good, and so he has some interest income. But that's a good question. And I think it was certainly one that I had to justify for myself for it to be in there. Merle and Eugene getting away scot-free. It's interesting you ask that, because I think that we must have sort of a similar sense of, or sort of desire for some sort of justice in the world, because I struggled with that issue too. And I think that what I eventually, and there were certainly, I wrote a number of endings for this book, and I wrote a number of chapters that are not in the book. So the book is, I can't remember, it's between 90 and 100. I should really count them. I can't remember how many days there are in the book, but I did write 365 of them. And so it's hard for me sometimes to remember what's actually in there and what's actually in here, but not in the version you read. And so for my own purposes, I wrote the chapter where Eugene pays in his body for some of his actions. And so I don't know if that would be, if you're a writer, if that would be cathartic for you to do something similar, but once I did it, and I started to think about it, I think that Eugene's punishment is there in the book, but it's not something that happens to him. I think it's the fact that he'll have to live his whole life knowing, and I think this depends on how introspective you think Eugene is, or how introspective Eugene will become as he ages. And I think that whatever you think of him, he does in his way love his children. And I think that the moment of grief that he has when he and Enid learn of Alcie's condition, I think that there is a reality in which at some point in his life, Eugene may reflect on that, watching his daughter age and struggle, and think about his own role in that there that's something that that child will live with her whole life, and he as a parent will live with seeing your whole life, and I think his whole life. And I think that for most parents, watching your child suffer is worse than suffering yourself. And so I think that is the place I came to with Eugene. And I don't know that that's terribly satisfying as a reader, but I think when I thought about that, I decided that I thought that was plenty for him to be dealt with in his life. And so, and then the third question, was it the prequel question? I'm sorry, I'm such an amateur. I should have written this down.
Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear that you assume that Eugene would have a crappy life. When it turned out that he set the fire and did the skulls, it was just, and you know, his kid who was like him almost killed Chubb. It was like, there needs to be some karmic retribution, but I'm glad to hear you envision that.
Oh,
no, my last
Colleen's baby.
Colleen's baby was my last question. I was trying to remember, when did they start drinking bottled water, and was that soon enough? Because I don't know when the baby was conceived, and she seemed to assume that it would be fine, which struck me as odd given the hell she had been through in her life.
Yeah, I think that is a really good question that I think on that one, I will take the fifth. In my mind, I have a very strong opinion about what I think she thinks and what I think the reality is. But I also think that that's something that I think is personal to the reader, and I would rather the reader decide where they think that's going to go. And I do think that that Colleen, despite her experiences, has an ability to hope. And I think especially given her circumstances at the end of the book, like the force of that hope is part of what's keeping her alive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for reading and for those tough questions.
All right, Mike and Charlotte have a question.
I hope my question is easier, but I was fascinated by your description of doing the interviews with people in the logging community and going back to Northern California. You lived there as a younger child, you said, and certainly you must have absorbed, you talk about absorbing a lot of things from that period. But my interest was, how did you approach and go back, and how did you initiate the conversations with the various peoples in the community to do the background research in your book?
Yeah, good question. So I was very young when my family left Klamath. My parents lived there for 8 years, but they left when I was 3. And so the memories that I have of Klamath are really my parents' memories that are sort of, I think, probably reimagined in my own mind. But I think it's impossible that I have one memory of we had this cat who could open the screen door with its paw and let itself in. And I have this one memory of the screen door closing that I think is maybe my memory really, truly, but the rest are sort of reconstructed and triangulated from their stories, I think. And so I had a fair number of their stories going back, and people that, you know, Klamath is a very small town. It's even smaller now than it was when they lived there, because at one time Klamath had, one of the loggers I interviewed told me when I was back there a couple of weeks ago that at one time Klamath had 18 working mills, which I wasn't aware of. And now I think that the last one there is idle, to the best of my knowledge. And so because the wood products industry has retracted so much and so much of the old growth is gone, the town itself is is quite small, but people have stayed put, like many of the people that my parents knew when they were there are still there in that town. And so I had written to Californians Against Toxic Sprays when I was first looking at the issue. And it was a woman there who told me, oh, you should read A Bitter Fog, which I did. And she also gave me a number of names of people who'd been active in the anti-spray movement in the Klamath area in that time period. And they were, almost all of them were members of the Yurok or Karok tribes. And so I called, I emailed, I wrote letters, and I didn't get any response. And so finally, I had a small research grant from the University of Iowa. If you proposed a class and taught it, and they wouldn't pay you, but in exchange, they would give you this small research grant. And so I taught my class and I took the research grant and went to Klamath in 2014. And then I just sort of started asking people, and it was, it's a small town, and it's, I don't know quite how to describe it. Rural might be one way to put it, but it's insular. And so I was clearly an outsider. My parents were outsiders when they lived there, even though my mom taught in the school at Margaret Keating there. They weren't from there. And so finally, kind of out of I had a really hard time getting people to talk to me. And just sort of out of desperation, we went to a community dinner in Klamath because I thought, well, there will probably be older people there. And so my mom is a real trooper. At that time she was teaching second grade, but she was on spring break. So she came with me because she loves Klamath and wanted to see it again. And so we walk into this community center in Klamath and you could just feel the heads turn, and so we paid for our tickets and took our trays and walked through the line. And then we just had this really junior high moment of standing there with our food thinking, where are we gonna sit? And then just by chance, this woman recognized my mom because they worked together at Margaret Keating Elementary School. And I guess 28 years later, my mom didn't look too different. And so she took us over to her table and she introduced me to a guy who'd cut a lot of old growth. And he wouldn't talk to me inside. And I thought he wasn't going to talk to me at all. But we went out to his truck in the parking lot. And I remember it because it was it wasn't really raining, but it was kind of misting. And I've lived in Arizona for many years. And we were, a short distance from a covered area. And I thought, well, we could just go stand over there, not in the rain. But he's worked outside his whole life. He doesn't even notice the rain. And so we just sort of leaned against the hood of his truck and talked for 2 hours. And he was a little circumspect at first. But then once he got going, the trust began to build. And the next time I interviewed him, he brought a photo album with him. And at that time, there wasn't a restaurant open in Klamath. There's one that opens up seasonally during salmon fishing season, but that time of year, there was basically a convenience store and a post office. And that was before they built the casino. So there was really nothing there. And there was this little Yurok owned inn, and it didn't have a restaurant in it, but it had a seating area. So he came in there and we sat down and he set this photo album down. We talked for several hours and I finally asked him, what's in the photo album? And he brought it out and it was all these photos of himself as a young man logging these giant old growth trees, trees that are 12 and 15 and 18 feet across. And this was documented there. And I was very moved by that because I don't know about you, I don't have any photos of myself at work, and the presence of mind and sort of the sadness of the realization that we are cutting trees that no human being alive today will ever see again. That he recognized that in that moment, that this was history to preserve. I was really touched by that. And so it was, and so that was how I met one source. One, I did manage to eventually get on the phone, and I don't know that he would have spoken to me, except that I was able to say, my parents remember you from this meeting all these years ago, and he finally agreed to let me come up to the house. And then there were sort of people who I met who were like, I sort of caught them at work, and so they couldn't exactly walk away. And there were some people who were eager to talk, and some people who, once they got going, no one was eager initially, and some who weren't. And there were a number of people who I had tried to get in touch with and didn't respond. And I never attempted to verify this on my own, so I don't know that it's true, but I was told by another source that those people had been impacted by herbicides and had settled with the logging company and had signed NDAs, and so perhaps couldn't speak for legal reasons. I also think that for some people, it might have been rehashing an experience that was painful for them or unpleasant. And it's not as if I'm a reporter or that I'm going to do anything really meaningful to, bring any sort of justice, or you can't change the past, right? And so I think they have, of course, have every right not to want to speak about an experience that they have, that for whatever reason they have moved on with their lives and they don't want to go back to. And it took me actually being there to realize that, oh, there are many reasons why someone might not want to speak about this period of their lives, and I absolutely do respect that. And I just am so grateful for the people who did take the time and the trust to share their experiences. And even though none of those experiences are used in their pure form in the book, there's something about speaking to people who've had that experience that I think enabled me to think about the issue more holistically and attempt to be more honest in writing about it and examine my own preconceptions walking into it, especially as someone who didn't come from a logging family.
And did you do this repeatedly over several years, or was it pretty much concentrated at the beginning of your writing?
I made 2 trips, so probably about 3.5 weeks total, over once in 2014 and once in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was very fortunate, back to Todd's initial point about the very long acknowledgement section, which should probably be much longer. I was very lucky along the way of when I realized that, oh, I don't know if I am understanding this correctly. There were people who I contacted by email or by phone who helped, even though some of them still I've never met. I've never met Amy Cordalis, the general counsel of the Yurok tribe, in person. I've only corresponded with her, and she read the book right before it was turned in, and I'm so grateful to her because she's just a brilliant mind, and from a long legacy of Yurok people who've worked to defend that river and really maintain the relationship that Yurok people have with the Klamath and its salmon. And she really helped me understand some intricacies of the legal history there that I had sort of twisted in, or I didn't have quite clear on the page, or things that like I had changed narratively, that she reminded me that there are people who, risked their lives in order for this, to protect this fishing right. And so this is a history that it's very important to get right on the page. And she also was really affirming and helpful in some ways, because I was very conscious about writing a character, even a secondary character like Daniel, who comes from a cultural background that's different from my own. There are many things that I could get wrong there, and there were many things that I was nervous about including. And she read and affirmed in places like, it's good to mention this is the right track. And I think I really appreciate that sensibility, which only comes from someone who has that lived experience. And because I am not part of that community and didn't grow up in that tradition, I just don't, I'm always guessing. You know, I'm triangulating my research and my interviews, and then sort of my own sort of creative instinct, I guess. And so Amy Cordelis was hugely generous to me. And so I've been very blessed along the way that people have taken time out of their busy lives and their own writing to help me. And I think it's a good lesson and reminder for me that if I don't have the type of expertise Amy has in anything really, but if I'm ever in a position to help another person who has a question about a particular place, that I should take the time to do it. Even something small, like my parents couldn't remember if Bistrons, the clothing store that Enid and Colleen go to get the kids' school clothes, they couldn't remember if it was pronounced bistrons, like biscuit, or beastrons. And I found someone who was blogging about her memories of Eureka, who confirmed that it was bistrons, like biscuit. And so just all along the way, there have been so many people who have lent a hand with their particular sort of being in the right place at the right time, and having this knowledge that as a novelist, you just can't access if you weren't there, which is problematic if you decide to set a novel in an era before you were born.
Well, and I was surprised to hear that you left at 3 and have only inherited memories, I guess, of the place, because I felt that your setting and your description, the feeling about the forest was so strong. And I was fortunate when I was growing up to visit my grandmother and aunt in Eugene over 5 or 7 summers. And we, of course, did go to the forest because everybody did. And so I remember it quite fondly. And I must say it meant a lot to me to read about it. And you did such a great job, from my perspective, of capturing the feeling of those western forests, northwestern forests.
Thank you so much. I love those forests. I think they're my favorite place on earth. So it was a great privilege to spend time in them, even in my imagination.
Well, you did an amazing job, Ash. And Todd was an early evangelist for this book, and rightly so. And all the accolades that you've received are so very well deserved. We're just so excited that you joined us, and this is even more than I thought it was going to be. I mean, I knew it was going to be great, but just your insight and all the background you've given us is just wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us. Todd, I'm sure you want to say something.
Well, we appreciate the generosity of you taking the time to join us. You know, we're kind of in a very rural area out here in a small town, and we've got it's a great customer base. But it's wonderful when a book of this quality comes into the world, let alone having the opportunity to speak with the author. So thank you so much, Ash. And here's to a wonderful future, I think.
Thank you so much for having me, and for the very early vote of confidence, and for everything you do to connect writers with their readers. And I really hope to make it out your way someday.
All right, we're open.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for reading and for being here.
Thank you.